So this video is about 14 to 15 years late, but I still figured it would make for an interesting discussion. If you grew up in the 2000s and 2010s and had Nickelodeon, then there's a good chance you watched Avatar: The Last Airbender. And you were probably a little disappointed in 2010 when a movie that was based on Avatar: The Last Airbender came out but somehow did not look like the cartoon at all. And while we do have a new live action show that has mixed reviews, the old film was pretty much condemned by everyone the moment the trailers came out. The Last Airbender is ranked among the worst films in director M. Night Shyamalan's career. I've still heard complaints about this film to this day, whether it's complaints about the slow fight scenes, the gimmicky 3D special effects, the poor acting, or the unnecessary whitewashing of the main characters while unnecessarily making the antagonist brown. And while I completely agree with all of these complaints, there is one complaint about this film that I'm going to push back on in this video. And that is the complaint about the mispronunciation of Aang's name.
My name is Aang.
Why is it Aang? People complain about this like it's the rotten cherry on top of a turd sundae. It seems like such an unnecessary change. So why did M. Night Shyamalan decide to do this? Did he not watch the show? Well, here's Shyamalan's explanation, which he gave in an interview on Oprah.com. In the interview, he says, instead of pronouncing Aang, it's Aang. You know, pronouncing it correctly. Small little things like that I literally fought for like bloodshed. That is symbolic of what we're doing here. For the cartoon, it's Aang, mispronounced. For the movie, I can't do that. I'm Asian. He then goes on to express how he believed changes like this would make fans say, wow, this is not catered. This is someone's point of view. Well, fans didn't go wow, and they didn't seem to care about this so-called point of view either. They wanted Aang. They didn't care about Aang's culture being accurately portrayed. They wanted his race to be accurately portrayed. And here lies the reason I want to defend M. Night Shyamalan's justification of calling Aang Aang. While a lot of importance is placed on racial representation, that same amount of importance is not always given to cultural representation. People believe it is important to accurately portray a character physically, while the intangible aspects of the character's culture is of little to no concern. For example, people are fine with the race of actress Kyo and Dio as Katara because she is Mohawk, and therefore an indigenous American who has physical features similar enough to Inuits, which the Water Tribe are based on. However, you might notice she doesn't have blue eyes like Katara, so fans are willing to give and take a little for the sake of realism. It's not like most Inuits have blue eyes like the Water Tribe after all. But if an actor pronounces an Asian name the way it would be pronounced in real life, that for some reason is seen as not accurate and not true to the source material. Now, when it comes to which Asian culture Shyamalan was referring to regarding the pronunciation of Aang's name, he doesn't really say, but I am going to argue that this decision to pronounce Aang's name as Aang actually portrays Aang's culture more than the original show's pronunciation. However, unlike Shyamalan, I am going to pinpoint which culture Aang's name could allude to, and that is the Sherpa culture of Nepal. To do this, we have to acknowledge the nature of language in the Avatar universe, and how names are interwoven with the cultural representation in the show. Language in the Avatar universe is arbitrary. Everyone in the show speaks English, but reads and writes in Chinese, and when they read Chinese, they read aloud in English, as if these languages have the same sentence structures. If you try to make sense of this, you might as well try to make sense of the fact that giant six-legged bison can fly in their world. Pronunciation is also arbitrary in the Avatar world. We know this due to cases like Toph, whose name sounds like tough, but if names in the original series were pronounced accurately and according to the way they are written, her name would probably sound more like tofu to the average Anglophone.
Tofu.
There are more linguistic anomalies to explore in Avatar, but for the sake of time, we can't get too deep into the linguistics of their world. The important thing to know is that there wasn't a whole Tolkien-esque set of linguistic systems thought out for this show, and most of the foreign names and loanwords used in the show are approached with very American accents. What is more important to know is the significance of names in the show, and how names are linked to cultural representation in the world of Avatar, especially since there is no concept of race in Avatar. People pay more attention to ethnicity than race, and yes, those are two different concepts. People in the Avatar universe give much more importance to things like cultural dress, or names found in specific ethnic groups, rather than the physical features often found among the four nations. Take for example when Aang suggests that Katara remove her necklace to better fit in the Fire Nation.
Your mom's necklace.
Oh yeah. I guess it's pretty obviously Water Tribe, isn't it?
Or how Piandao recognizes Sokka as Water Tribe because of his name.
Of course, I knew from the beginning that Sokka was Water Tribe. You might want to think of a better Fire Nation cover name. Try Lee. There's a million Lees.
Don't get me wrong, there are definitely common physical traits found in people depending on which culture they are from. Fans have noticed that most people from the Water Tribes have blue eyes, most people from the Earth Kingdom have green eyes, most people from the Fire Nation have amber eyes, and most Air Nomads have gray eyes. This observation is at the core of a popular theory that states that Ty Lee is an airbender because of her physical features, which include the Air Nomad gray eyes, and there's already a ton of videos about that on YouTube. However, again, no one in-universe directly draws any attention to these sort of patterns of eye color, skin color, and hair color. Like Piandao could not just say, oh, you're from the Water Tribe because you have brown skin and blue eyes. If it were that simple, the Fire Nation could have just gone full eugenics mode and wiped out anyone with gray eyes to make sure that there's no airbenders left. But they didn't do that, because they're more concerned with ethnic markers like clothing or names. So, culture plays a huge role in Avatar, and just like the biology where we see many real-world animals and sometimes plants being mixed together to create things like platypus bears and lychee nuts, each culture in Avatar is a mix of several real-world cultures. This is a world of amalgamations. For example, every culture in Avatar has some aspect of Chinese culture. Everyone from every nation can read and write in Chinese. Earth, fire, water, and airbending are all based on different Chinese martial arts. However, beyond that, they are not all just Chinese-inspired. The Water Tribes are based on Inuit and various other Native American cultures, while characters like Yue have Chinese names. The Fire Nation has been compared to both Japan and Southeast Asia, and the Earth Kingdom is by far the most Chinese, although there are some aspects of other cultures, like King Bumi's name, for example, is a Sanskrit word for Earth. We could go on and on. So what real-world cultures make up Aang's culture? The Air Nomads definitely stick out among the four nations due to the monasticism in their culture. The way they practice this monastic life definitely parallels many real-world Buddhist monastic practices. They both shave their heads, they both live in some form of monastery, and they both abstain from eating meat. However, Buddhism is a very large and diverse world religion, and it is practiced in very different ways depending on the culture it finds itself in. We need to look at which culture, with Buddhism, shares the most similarities with Aang's culture. Now, I think for most people, the idea of monks training in martial arts definitely harkens back to China's Shaolin Buddhist tradition. And while the orange color worn by the monks in Avatar: The Last Airbender, especially Aang's sleeveless robe, could be a reference to the Shaolin Buddhist monks, it could also be referencing Theravada Buddhist cultures that are prevalent in Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, or in the South Asian island country of Sri Lanka. The tattoos in Airbender culture could also be referencing the Buddhist Sakyant tattoos found in Thailand. However, besides these examples, there is one culture with Buddhist monks that Air Nomad culture and history parallels more than any other, and that is Tibetan culture. The most difficult thing about comparing Air Nomad culture to Tibetan culture is deciding where to even begin. How about where they live? 3 out of 4 air temples are built on top of mountains, while the Western air temple is built into a cliff. In the show, emphasis is given to how hard air temples are to reach without gliders or flying bison. Tibet is one of the highest elevated regions in the world and is home to some of the highest elevated monasteries and temples in the world, like Rongbuk Monastery, which is situated right next to Mount Everest. But what about the Western Air Temple, which is located in a cliff? I think this could have actually been inspired by a famous Tibetan Buddhist temple, which isn't even in Tibet, and that is the Parotatsang Monastery in Bhutan, which sits on a cliff and is actually built out of a cave. The cave portion is actually part of the temple. Similarly, the Western Air Temple is built out of a cliff and incorporates tunnels. Now, you might be thinking, that's Bhutan. I thought you were talking about Tibetan culture. Well, here's the thing about Tibetan culture. It has had a strong influence on other countries in the world, especially countries in the Himalayas. Elements of Tibetan culture exist in Bhutanese culture, Nepali culture, and thanks to Tibetan refugees, including the 14th Dalai Lama, you can find these cultures in India. Elements of Tibetan culture can also be found all the way in Mongolia, where Tibetan Buddhism is practiced. Tibetic languages, Tibetan food, Tibetan Buddhist temples, and other elements of Tibetan culture can all be found in these countries. And like the Air Nomads, Tibetans don't have their own recognized independent country. However, Unlike the Air Nomads, who may have chosen to be untethered to a worldly country, Tibet was pretty much forced to be an autonomous region belonging to China. This brings me to the next big similarity between Air Nomads and Tibetans, and that is their history of religious persecution by an outside force. It's not too hard to draw parallels with the way China attacked Tibet and the way the Fire Nation attacked the air temples. Now, obviously, Tibet's annexation by the People's Republic of China is way more complex than the plans of a cartoon villain who can throw fireballs from his hands, and I'm not trying to make light of Tibet's situation by comparing it to a cartoon, nor am I trying to make a political statement. I just think the creators of Avatar intended to tackle these types of complex subjects like colonization and genocide, and this wouldn't be the last time they used Chinese history as an inspiration for conflict as they continue to make these kinds of references in The Legend of Korra. If this is not enough evidence that Air Nomads are Tibetan, the franchise of Avatar has gone out of its way to make Air Nomads more and more Tibetan since the conclusion of the original show. In the original run, there were already plenty of ways the Air Nomad culture paralleled Tibetan Buddhist cultures. In addition to what I've already mentioned, the way the monks find the reincarnation of the Avatar in the show is similar to the Tibetan Buddhist Tulku tradition. In the original show, there are 4 main air temples. In real life, there are 4 dominant schools/traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And the significance of flying bison in airbender culture could be referencing the significance of yaks in Tibetan culture. But in Korra, they went even further and added to the airbenders' orange and yellow garb by incorporating red, making these robes that more closely resemble actual Tibetan Buddhist robes, which are often red and yellow with some blue thread. And in the comics, they go even further, making mani beads, stupas, Tibetan drums, Tibetan horns, Tibetan parasols, mani wheels/prayer wheels, and even dorjes, all significant objects in the Air Nomad culture. These are all common objects in Tibetan Buddhism as well. A few years ago, they even released an official Avatar cookbook, which added a few unique Tibetan staples as part of the Air Nomad diet. And those staples are tsampa and butter tea. Tsampa is a type of roasted barley flour that Tibetans use to make porridge, but is also used during some rituals. Butter tea is a salty, buttery tea that is popular in every Tibetan-related culture. The cookbook decides to add these things as airbender staples even though the show never mentions them. So if this isn't enough to convince you that airbender culture is based on Tibetan culture, I don't know what will. Now, how does all of this relate to Aang and the Sherpa culture that I mentioned earlier? I promise I am getting there. On the Avatar wiki, we can find a list of airbender names and their real-life languages of origin, and a majority of these names are cited as Tibetan in origin. However, I think the wiki is misguided on some of these names. For example, there is one name on this list that could either be Arabic or Sanskrit. Now, here's the thing about names. Certain similar sounding names can be found in multiple cultures but mean very different things. The English name Sheila and the Indian name Sheila are 2 different names with 2 different histories, and if I was making a video about an American with European ancestry named Sheila, I would focus on the European etymology of the name, not the South Asian etymology of a similar sounding name. So in this case, due to the sheer amount of Tibetan names and the amount of other South Asian names, I'm going to go ahead and say that this name is probably just another Sanskrit name and not Arabic. Now, some of you may be wondering why the presence of Tibetan names makes me feel that this name is a South Asian Sanskrit name. Well, Tibet is kind of a culturally unique place in the typical Western imagined geography in that it really blurs the line of what Westerners perceive as East Asia and what they perceive as South Asia. What I mean by that is if your average American or European saw a Tibetan person, they would probably think, yeah, that person is East Asian. If they saw what Tibetans eat, they would probably think, yeah, that's East Asian food. And the spoken Tibetan language is categorized as part of the Sino-Tibetan language family, the same language family as Mandarin. However, the writing system was adopted from the South Asian Gupta writing script, which means the Tibetan script is related to scripts found in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Tibet actually has a rich history of cultural trade with the Indian subcontinent, especially in the medieval period during Buddhism's heyday in northern India's Pala Empire, where Tibetans would travel to the renowned Nalanda monastery located in modern Bihar, India to study Buddhism. Many Tibetan Buddhist figures are South Asian in origin themselves, such as Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche, the founder of the Nyingmapa tradition, which is considered to be the oldest school in Tibetan Buddhism. He is believed to have been born in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Or even Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Shakyamuni Buddha, who is believed to have been born in what is now modern-day Nepal. This relationship between Tibet and South Asia is also referenced in the show through the character Guru Pathik, who has an Indian accent, a Hindi name, South Asian features, and refers to himself as a spiritual brother to the Air Nomads. Now, back to the names. So, the wiki lists some of these names as Bhutanese and Tibetan, which is odd since a lot of Bhutanese names actually are just Tibetan names, but if you look into the wiki sources, they seem to just be echoing what this Behind the Name website says. But what the website doesn't explain is that many Bhutanese names are just Tibetan names, and Bhutan has been heavily shaped by Tibetan culture for hundreds of years. Now, let's take a look at the Japanese names. Okay, this name Soma is listed as Japanese for genuine, however, Soma could easily be a South Asian name. Soma is a Sanskrit word for moon, and there's also a drink of the gods in Hindu Vedic texts called Soma as well. And then there's Momo's name. The wiki says that it's Japanese for peach. Now, this may be true, however, Momo is also a type of Tibetan dumpling, and this isn't some obscure Tibetan food either. You can find momos not only as staples in Tibetan culture, but Nepali and Bhutanese culture as well. They are also getting popular in India and anywhere else you find a diaspora community of Tibetan, Nepali, and Bhutanese people. Some of the Japanese names are undeniable, like otaku, a Japanese word for an anime nerd, and this character isn't even from the Airbender culture anyway, he was integrated into it, so this one makes sense. It's fine if not all of these names are South Asian or Tibetan, the point is that most of them are. Again, Avatar is a world of amalgamations. Plus, the Air Nomads are nomads after all, so it's completely possible for some of them to adopt names from many other cultures they interact with. Same goes for the two Chinese names, like one of them is Chang. This could be a word for a type of Tibetan rice beer, but I don't think it would make much sense for a virtuous monk to be named after alcohol. So, like the Japanese names, these two Chinese names can stay as Chinese names. Again, this doesn't change the fact that most of the names are either Tibetan or South Asian. Okay, so finally let's move on to two very important names on this list, Appa and Aang. The wiki lists the origin of Appa's name as unspecified, and says that the Chinese spelling is just phonetic. And while I can believe that the Chinese spelling is just phonetic, I'm not convinced that there is no culture of origin for this name. But we'll get back to that later. As for Aang's name, the wiki doesn't say that his name is Chinese in origin, but it is somewhat implied in that they just provide two Chinese characters and say that it just means peaceful soaring. Now, I can get behind the fact that Aang might spell his name like this in the global writing script of their world,
I'll just write down my best guess.
but I am not convinced that he would actually say his name like,
Aang.
or that his name would be Chinese when there is a much closer name from a culture that also practices Tibetan Buddhism, and that name is the Sherpa name, Aang. Aang is a common name in the Sherpa culture. While Sherpa culture may look a lot like Tibetan culture to most outsiders, Sherpa culture is its own unique culture. Most of their similarities lie in the fact that both Tibetan culture and Sherpa culture is heavily steeped in Tibetan Buddhism. One might also find them hard to distinguish from one another due to some similar clothing styles, some similar foods, and similar music. But it is important to note that Sherpa culture and Sherpa identity is unique, and it would be a mistake to call a Sherpa person Tibetan. They don't even speak the same language, after all. It is similar to the fact that just because Japan shares some cultural similarities with China, or just because Mexico has some cultural similarities with Guatemala, that doesn't mean one can just call Chinese people Japanese, or Mexican people Guatemalans. In the same sense, it's not correct to just call Sherpas Tibetans, or vice versa. So why did I spend so much time talking about Tibet? Well, just because Aang's name could be from the Sherpa culture, that doesn't mean that all the Air Nomads are based on Sherpa people. It's possible that some of the Air Nomads are based on Sherpa people, while others are based on Tibetans. Even in real life, if you were to visit a really big and significant Tibetan Buddhist monastery, it is possible to find a few Sherpa monks among the Tibetan monks that live there, especially if the monastery is associated with the Nyingmapa tradition. It is also possible that some Air Nomads have purely Tibetan names, while others have purely Sherpa names, while others may have names that belong to both cultures. Think of it like how Spanish and Italian are both Latin languages, and just like you can find some names in both Spain and Italy that sound the same and have the same origin, you can also find names in Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal that are the same and share the same origin. But you can also find names that are more unique to one culture than the other, despite their deep linguistic connection. And while the Avatar wiki only has this to say about Aang's name, there is actually a real-world Tibetic language-speaking culture in Nepal that has a very similar sounding name, the Sherpa culture. Sherpa people are the people in the Solukhumbu region of Nepal who live right next to Mount Everest. Now, a lot of people seem to think Sherpa just means guide or porter or some kind of fleece that goes inside your jacket, but these are all incorrect definitions. The word means Eastern people. It's an ethnonym. Just like how Japanese is an ethnonym for someone from Japan, Sherpa is an ethnonym for someone from the Sherpa caste/ethnic group of Nepal. And just like there is a Japanese language, Japanese food, traditional Japanese clothing, and other aspects that make up Japanese culture like Shinto and Zen Buddhism, there is a Sherpa language, Sherpa food, traditional Sherpa clothing, and other aspects that make up Sherpa culture like the adherence to the Nyingma and Gelug schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Sherpa is also used as a last name, so while many Sherpa people have first names that are Tibetan in origin, it's easy to tell if they are from the Sherpa culture and not some other Tibetic language-speaking group because they'll have the last name Sherpa. So knowing that, if you go ahead and type Aang Sherpa into Google, you'll find plenty of people that are actually named Aang. But is that how it's actually pronounced? And what does this name even mean? How is it spelled? Is it spelled with one A or is it spelled with two A's like Aang? It was at this point that my research began to hit a wall. That wall being the fact that there's not a lot of easily accessible information about Sherpas online outside of the realm of mountaineering, which is a shame because I think there's a lot to be said about the Sherpa culture. So to explore Aang and the other airbender names and their cultural ties to the Sherpa people, I knew I was going to need some help. And while I could have sent several friend requests to the many Aang Sherpas on Facebook to ask them about their name for a YouTube video about a cartoon, that would have been weird. So instead, I went to the Sherwi Rishung Lopta Cultural Center located in Queens, New York. This cultural center is a branch of the United Sherpa Association, Inc., also known as Sherpa Kidug, a non-profit, non-political corporation that works to promote and preserve the Sherpa culture among Sherpa people in New York City. The Sherwi Rishung Lopta Cultural Center offers classes on the Sherpa language, Sherpa dance, as well as Tibetan Buddhist lectures, and other educational experiences related to the Sherpa culture. Here, I met with Dawa Yangi Sherpa, an executive board member of the United Sherpa Association, Inc. When I told Dawa I was planning on making a video essay about Sherpa names and Avatar the Last Airbender, she was generous enough to set up an interview with one of the teachers at the center, Gyala Chodrak, who I will be referring to in the video as Gyala. Gyala studied at the Nyagyur Nyingma Institute and has been teaching Tibetan script every Saturday and Sunday for Sherpa Kidug since 2009. I came to this interview with a list of names from the Air Nomad culture and a set of questions for Gyala. Dawa was there not only as a coordinator of the interview, but also acted as the interpreter. So the first name on the list is the name of the main character. In the main show it's pronounced Aang, but in the movie it's pronounced Aang. They have Chinese characters here. I think it's because in the show all of the writing is in Chinese,
Yes.
like in the show. So even if something's like in another language, it's all the writing in the show is Chinese. But how common is the name Aang or Aang in Sherpa culture?
उसलाई चाहिँ अब स्टार्ट गर्दैछु हैन अब मैले भने जस्तै अघि त्यो कार्टुनको मेन क्यारेक्टर मेन मान्छेको नाम चाहिँ आङ आङ हो हामीले चाहिँ द्याट्स हाउ वी प्रोनाउन्स आङ हैन सो त्यसको बाद आङ भनेको चाहिँ हाम्रो
शब्दको आङ भन्ने शब्दमा अहिलेसम्म कुनै एक्सपेरिमेन्ट गरेको डिजाइन त्यसो मैले केही पनि हेर्नु पाएन हैन अब म मेरो व्यक्तिगतको मैले
the first way he started breaking down the word Aang, right? So it's actually Anga within the Sherpa culture. Anga basically means somebody who's like a baby or young. Anga. And then when he broke down the word Anga, for example, A is like the first letter of any alphabet, generally. His take on like this word itself is that that's the first word that an infant usually like says. And the way within the Sherpa culture is like your relationship to your parent or to like anybody within the community. So from A, it goes on to like adding the word like ma, basically ama, which is mother. And then it goes to like the second word that an infant would learn is pa, which goes on to being like pala or papa, you know. So it's kind of like also the language takes another step. It just goes on, builds up on that.
Okay.
And then nga is basically just one of the letters that the parent has just added. And then anga together means somebody who's younger or like somebody who's a baby.
Okay.
And then it kind of evolved into Aang, which
Okay.
basically is just added as like, for example, if there is 3 brothers and the youngest would generally like be like an Aang Pasang, Aang Dawa, Aang something, right? So it's
Okay.
basically like kind of also denotes the youngest.
Okay, so it's attached as kind of like a prefix
Yes.
to the youngest siblings
Yes.
or the youngest child's name. Okay.
मेरो भिजामा यो चाहिँ टिबेटनको पनि होइन नेपालीको पनि होइन अब प्योर शेर्पा भाषा भने यो होला जस्तो मलाई लाग्छ
That's right. Yeah, so this Aang itself is like quite central to the Sherpa culture.
Okay.
We have a lot of similarities with the Tibetan culture and Tibetan names, but this is quite unique in terms of
Okay.
the relationship and in terms of how it is used across the Sherpa culture.
यहाँ चाहिँ आम बोल्दैन
Tibetans, they don't use the word Aang.
रिजल्टले बोल्दैन कहिले कसैले पनि बोल्दैन
This was a fascinating revelation, because while a name that means peaceful soaring admittedly does fit Aang's characterization, so does a name that means young person, as the internal conflict Aang feels about his age and his intense responsibilities as the Avatar is a recurring theme throughout the show. However, as Dawa stated, if someone is named Aang, the Aang is usually followed by another given name. But is this always the case? Well, according to Dawa, no, it's not. Do people ever go by Aang, like just like among
Yes,
friends?
yes,
Like,
yeah.
okay.
My friend's brother is named Aang.
Okay, so you just call him Aang. Is that attached to like the
It's
name of?
not attached.
Oh no,
to
so it's just Aang Sherpa.
Yes.
Okay.
But then there's a lot of like Aang Pasang, Aang
Yeah.
and then Aang, like, you know, it's across Aang Dawa. Like,
So even though it is more common for the name Aang to be followed by another Sherpa name, it is also possible for someone to simply be named Aang, like Aang is simply named Aang. But what about the spelling? This was a little more complicated. Regarding like the sort of romanization of the names. So I've seen, for example, names like Nima, because it's not, originally an English name, people will use the English letters to just make the sound, that it's supposed to make. So some people will spell N-E-E-M-A, some people will spell N-I-M-A, and in the show, Aang spells his name with 2 A's. So I was wondering if you've ever seen Aang spelled with 2 A's, or if it's usually just 1 A.
I think I can respond to that. When you're spelling Aang in the Tibetan script,
Yeah.
everybody knows like there's a grammatical like way of spelling it, so
Yeah.
we know what it is. But when that's translated to English, it takes its own forms.
Yes.
So Dawa, for example, like people may just say Dawa with double A, for
Yeah.
example. So and then there's no way of actually saying which is correct and which is not,
Yeah.
unless you're a very big linguistic person,
Mm.
right? So I think that really depends on how the writers or how like people who are taking up that word from a culture, like shares with others, and then
Okay.
it kind of becomes mainstream. Right?
Okay.
The way people have translated things in English is really up to the person who's taken up the name from the culture.
Okay.
Yeah, so the double A in Aang is definitely to ensure that it doesn't have that association with Aang, because A-N-G Aang is like, it's a given. Like that's
Yeah.
how most of the Sherpa people have been using the name.
Yeah.
I haven't seen with double A.
So, unfortunately for my argument, Dawa told me that no, most people don't spell Aang with 2 A's like Aang. However, I would like to point out that the pinyin spelling of Aang also does not use the double A. Now, what about Appa's name? The next name we're looking at is Appa, so if you could tell us a little bit about the name Appa.
So apa चाहिँ त्यसको बारेमा अलिकति त्यो हाम्रोमा युज कसरी युज गर्छ
कुन चाहिँ?
apa
आपा
हजुर
आपा चाहिँ आपा भनेको ड्याडी होइन
हजुर
यो चाहिँ फेरि यस्तो छ कि हाम्रो शेर्पाको भाषाहरू धेरै खोजी गऱ्यो भनेदेखि धेरै पुरानो
Appa
भाषा
is not the way it is spelled out apa. It's not a Sherpa word. It's
Okay.
more Tibetan.
Oh, it's more
because it's a
Tibetan.
very old Tibetan word.
Okay.
And apa is basically means papa or like dad.
Okay.
Literal translation is dad. Appa.
Okay.
And then the Sherpa language, they kind of have it in similar tone, but they call it Hapa instead of Appa.
Okay.
They have Ha instead of A.
Okay. But I thought I've seen like Sherpa people named Appa. So is it ever without the ha sound or?
So हाम्रोमा चाहिँ अब आपा भनेर शेर्पा मान्छेहरू तिनजना
शेर्पा
नाम
कम्ती बोल्छ साथै मेरो हिसाबले हाम्रो खुम्बु क्षेत्रतिर हो भने
So,
आफै
yeah, he's not like so. Appa, it's like it's a Tibetan word.
Okay.
So there might the Sherpa people who have that word as the name might have some influence from the Tibetan culture.
Okay.
So because there's a lot of cross marriages as well.
Yeah.
Or like their ancestors are like Tibetan, like their grandfather might be Tibetan or their grandmother might be Tibetan. So that might be the influence.
Okay.
But yeah, it's usually not a name that is generally given within the Sherpa culture.
Okay. So you know some Sherpa people also named Appa?
Yeah, I know 2 or 3 brothers. Yeah.
Okay, but it's not very common.
It's not very common, but yeah, I think there's like 2 or 3 people that have that name that I know of. But then they also share like Tibetan heritage. So that might be the influence.
So yeah. So according to Gyala, Appa is not a Sherpa name. It's a Tibetan word meaning father. And while there are some Sherpa people named Appa, this could suggest a closer relation to Tibet. So if a Sherpa person is named Appa, this could suggest that they are more directly from Tibet or one of their parents or grandparents is Tibetan. Now, when it comes to the rest of the names, Dawa was nice enough to take time out of her busy schedule to go through the list of Air Nomad names and mark which names show up in Sherpa culture. And based on her notes, I could more accurately revise this list of how many names are from which places according to the wiki. Now, this still isn't a perfect set-in-stone list. For example, many of these Sanskrit names could probably be found in Nepal or India. Some of the names listed as Hindi could also be Nepali and vice versa. Many of the Tibetan names and Tibetan/Sherpa names could also be found in other countries like Bhutan. There's also names like Appa, which is more Tibetan but may be used by some Sherpas due to cultural mixing, and as intercaste marriage becomes more accepted in Nepal, you can find people like the golfer Pratima Sherpa, who has a Nepalese first name and the Sherpa last name. There's also names on the list like Tao, which I removed because the wiki lists this name as Nepali, but for the life of me I could not find any Nepali person online with this name or any information about the translation that the wiki provides, and it didn't seem like Dawa could either. Now, I thought this was as far as I was going to be able to go with this argument that Aang is a more accurate pronunciation of Aang because of Aang's cultural similarities to the Sherpa culture, and I thought I was pretty much done. But then I saw this. This is one of Dawa's notes, and in her note she spells the name Aang for me using the Devanagari script, which is the way most Sherpas write. According to Gyala and Dawa, most Sherpas don't actually know Tibetan script despite speaking a Tibetic language. They mostly use Devanagari, the same script used for the Nepali alphabet. Do many Sherpa people know how to write the Tibetan script?
धेरै मान्छेलाई आउँदैन
आउँदैन
धेरै कम हो
Okay. So it's
मेरो हिसाबले 10%
10%.
मात्र छैन
So yeah, he's saying that it's very little, 10%, maybe 10%, but it's very little that like who can write in Tibetan script.
Okay. Alright, so
अब यो पनि म अलिकति कारण बोलौँ होइन
हजुर
अब टिबेटन मान्छेले धेरै टिबेटन बोल्नु पनि सक्दैन पढ्नु पनि सक्दैन कारण किन भनेदेखि पहिले कमिसन मेरो
It's so like traditionally because like there's no like schools that actually teach Tibetan script or like usually like within like for example if you think about Nepal within the Solkumba district or the region it's usually like everything is taught in either English or Nepali so there is not like a formal like Sherpa language or Tibetan language like classes. The way Tibetan script has been mostly preserved is through the monasteries and kumbas.
Now, why am I making a big deal about this? Well, it's the way she spells Aang. If we break down the spelling, there are basically 2 letters here, the Nepali vowel A and the half version of the Nepali consonant Nga. Unlike the English alphabet, which has 5 vowels and 21 consonants, the Nepali alphabet has a whopping 13 vowels and 36 consonants, and that's before you add dependent vowels. So I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. The first 2 vowels in the Nepali alphabet are A and A. The vowel Dawa used for the name Aang is the second vowel, the A. The second letter is the consonant Nga. Put these 2 together and you get Anga, which we could transliterate like this using the International Alphabet of Sanskrit Transliteration. Now, if we add this little line under the Nga letter like Dawa did, this cuts the Nga in half, which would drop our final A in the transliteration. However, if we use another transliteration system like the Indian languages transliteration system or the Valthui system, then this A with the line above it becomes a double A. And this is honestly how a lot of Nepali people transliterate this letter, at least when it's by itself. Unfortunately though, if we are using the itrans or Valthui system, then the in with the dot on top of it either becomes this or this. Now, if we wanted to mix and match the way Sherpas usually transliterate the name Aang into English and the English transliteration of the Nepali spelling of Aang using the itrans or Valthui system, then we could hypothetically spell Aang like Aang, but I think it's a little contrived at this point. So here's the big question. With all of this in mind, do I really think M. Night Shyamalan really thought about all of this when he said he wanted to pronounce Aang correctly? No, not really. I mean, I guess it's possible, but I think it's far more likely that M. Night Shyamalan, as a South Asian person, saw the double A and pronounced it like any South Asian word transliterated with a double A, like naan or pan. But regardless, like I said at the start of this video, I thought this would be a really interesting discussion, and I really thought it was. I honestly had a lot of fun talking with Gyala and Dawa about this, and if you want to see the full interview, you can click here. There's a lot more information about the Sherpa people, how Sherpa people are named, what their names mean. There's information about Sherpa history and Sherpa culture. And if you're in the New York City area and you're interested to know more about the Sherpa culture, definitely check out Sherpa Kidug. They are very welcoming and they have a lot of events throughout the year. I want to thank Gyala and Dawa for allowing me into their space at the Sherwi Rishung Lopta Cultural Center and allowing me to film there and ask them questions. I also want to thank Furba Sherpa, whose music I used in this video. Go check him out. He sings a lot of traditional style Sherpa and Tibetan songs. I also want to thank Kalzong Sherpa, who introduced me to Dawa. If it wasn't for him reaching out to someone from Sherpa Kidug, who knows if I would have been able to make this video. And finally, if you made it all the way through this video, I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something about the Sherpa culture, and if there's any other cultural references that I missed, please leave a comment down below. I would like to make this a space of continued growth and learning, and I will see you in the next video.